Let me just tell you a little bit what crucifixion was all about. This is one of the teachings that I did in the States. And then some guy went off and made a movie. What's his name? I did this teaching over in Pancho's church. He gave me his Sunday. I had people walking out. They couldn't take it. I had to go on PowerPoint. It was very, very... Anyway. Crucifixion, by the way, was not invented by the Romans. It was invented by the Persians. It was brought back to the Mediterranean basin by the Greeks. It was copied by the Romans and perfected by the Romans. It was a source of capital punishment in the colonies, not necessarily in Italy or Rome itself. A Roman citizen could not be crucified. The only exception of the rule is a caught army deserter. He was crucified. Now, the whole idea of crucifixion, of course, was to make you die, but the whole idea was to make you suffer for as long as possible and to humiliate you. That's crucifixion. In general, always, the site of crucifixion will always be within the site of one of the major gates of the city and next to a major road. Why? Because the person who was condemned and did not receive a cross, he couldn't carry it. A healthy man couldn't carry it, and they tried doing it, I think once on the Adventures Channel, I don't know. It's like 600 pounds, man. If the guy weighed 120 pounds, there's no way he's going to carry a 600-pound cross through the cobblestones of Jerusalem. The crossbeam was also a trial. The crossbeam was 90 pounds. That's almost the weight of a person. And the Romans always had a permanent post in the ground at the site of crucifixion. Or it could very well have been the trunk of an olive tree with its limbs cut off. There's references all through scriptures that talk about how they took our Lord and they nailed him to an olive tree. And it wasn't very high. Usually the person was no more than maybe a foot or two above the ground. Okay? Alright, so this person was about to be crucified. He'd be laid into with a lashing, not necessarily a whipping. It's called a flagellator, like a flagellation, if you would. Okay? A scourging. It's a post about this big with strands of leather. Sometimes they would dip it into hot lead and then just let it dry at the bottom. So you have like jagged pieces of balls of lead at the end. And then they intermediately tie in pieces of animal bone inside. So that the person now who's administering this was a professional, and he knew how to use his wrist movement, that every time he lashed out at the person, he would tear flesh and tissue. Usually a person could not take more than half a dozen of these. It was basically just to soften you up, and it really did. It opened you to the bone. The person is then given the crossbeam, and now he's taken out to the site of crucifixion. Usually, well, almost all the time, the officer of the guard or the legionnaire would have a stick or a post like this holding in his hand, and a plank on it with the person's crying. And they marched down the street holding this. So now, the person who's about to be crucified is totally undressed. All his clothing is taken off him. A part of crucifixion is the humiliation. And what's the worst humiliation that a man can have? Is showing his nakedness. Okay, he's thrown to the ground, which means that all those pebbles and rough sand and stuff is embedding itself now into its open wounds on his back. The Romans looked around now for that little impression in your wrist over here. They know a lot about the anatomy of a person. You know that the nail didn't go through the palm. It went over here. And they knew by hammering in 4 to 5 inch nails, it did not sever any major arteries that there'll be a lot of blood. No, but it does sever something very important. It's called the median nerve or the motosensory nerve. It is probably the most sensitive nerve in your whole body. So imagine now you have a rough piece of iron going through your wrist with an electrical wire rubbing up against it. That's the pain that you're getting. Your hand automatically makes that claw-like impression like this. You know that? Okay. So now, the person is lifted up, usually by pitchforks, holding onto the crossbeam, and he's lifted up to the post. The post had like a tongue and groove on the top, and boom, he's in place. And it looked like this. Guys, it didn't look like the Latin cross that way it used to. It looked like this, a T. Got it? A T. It's called a tau, T-A-U. Then they would take that stick, put the sign on it, and tie it to the back of the post, so therefore to be above the person's head, it gave the impression of a cross like that. The person's chest cavity is now falling forward. All the weight of this person's body is on his wrists, nailed to the wood. And because he's hanging now, his body weight is now quadrupled, in a sense. Okay? And automatically, his bones usually come out of his sockets. He's dislocated. and his whole chest cavity has fallen forward. There's a little bit of a podium that he can possibly rest himself on. Now, either his legs would straddle the post and they would put nails in through both sides, or they would bend the person's legs more or less like this, okay? A very uncomfortable position, and then the nail will go through both feet on the top. The whole chest cavity now is fallen forward. The person now on the cross wants to take a deep breath of air, fills up his lungs. And that's when it begins. By lifting up his arms and putting all the pressure on his wrist, now he's getting that electric shock wave of pain going through his body because of that severed nerve. Have you heard of the word called excruciating? Excruciating comes from crucifixion. They both had the Latin term in it, cruce, which means cross. Think about that. So now the person is taking small gasps of air because he's afraid of that pain. And in doing so, not enough oxygen is going into his circulation. His circulation is becoming sluggish and very slow. The blood is becoming thick. It's not pumping at the rate that it should be going in. The abs and the muscles on his chest are starting to tighten. And because there's not enough blood going into his heart, there's not enough adrenaline going into his brain, he's now going into a very, very slow shock. And in doing so, fluid is starting to fill up into his lungs. So by the third day after this, he dies of a very, very slow asphyxiation or suffocation. That's crucifixion. If a person was still alive after 3 days, then the Romans had this contraption that looked like a big hammer, and they went about and they broke your kneecaps so that you couldn't support yourself anymore on the cross. We have instances, of course, if someone had a few shekels perhaps, they would approach one of the Roman guards and say, please take this offering and break my husband's legs before you crucify him. This way he would die quicker. And by the way, the bodies were never allowed to be taken off the cross. They were left there to rot. The dogs of the city would come out and tear out the flesh, and the birds will come down as well. That's crucifixion. Now, you've had your teachings and everything concerning the Garden of Gethsemane and all that. I personally, when I read that particular chapter about the Garden of Gethsemane, although I cannot forget that Jesus is the Son of the living God, I feel for the human Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Because now his emotions are starting to run away from him. I don't really want to die that way. Who knows how many times in that period of time he may have even started walking up that hill to go on the other side. Because don't forget, there's a haven there. Judean wilderness, always to come back. He went through the ultimate death because he had to pay the ultimate sin. You understand that, right? That's the way he had to go. Everything that I described to you happened to Christ. They also bowed down in front of him. And they made fun of him. They jested him, calling him a king. They took chances spitting at him and beating him with a staff. They took also, this is nothing that was prepared in advance. You know that the crown of thorns was basically a twine that they used for tying up firewood. So they spun it around, they stuck it on his head. They're very thick, they're very sharp, and as you know that once you get puncture wounds in your head, more blood comes out. This man had now probably lost nearly half the body fluids in his body. He's given a crossbeam, and even that was an effort for him, because later on Simon has to carry it for him. He can't do it. And then he's crucified. Now you know everything that happens to him, right? We don't know 100% how many pieces of garment that he had, but let's assume that he had the normal amount that a Jew would wear. 5 pieces. An undercloak or an undergarment, an overcloak, a sash or a belt holding everything together, some sort of head covering, and a pair of sandals. If we assume that there were 4 Roman guards, and these guys were not paid a lot of money, there was a market for rags and pieces of leather. They wanted to get something out of this. Maybe because Christ had his prayer shawl with him, which was seamless, and perhaps maybe it had a number of rows of that purple or blue dye that's inside that's literally worth its weight in gold. That's when they started to barter for it. He's dehydrating, he's in shock, his tongue is probably twice the size that it should be, probably sticking to the top of his mouth. He's put onto the cross, but unlike all the others, he did not take 3 days to die.